Imagine stepping off a creaking wooden ship onto an unknown shore, the salty Atlantic wind hitting your face, the forest stretching endlessly ahead. This was the reality for the first English settlers. Arriving in the early 1600s, they weren't stepping into an empty wilderness, they were stepping into a world already alive with Native American nations, trade networks, and conflicts. But for the colonists, it felt like the edge of the known world. The story of colonial America begins with survival. Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement, was a desperate gamble. The settlers expected gold and easy wealth, but instead they found swamps, disease, and hunger. Many died in the first year. The ones who lived survived only because of uneasy alliances with the Powhatan people, alliances that could turn violent overnight. Life was brutal. There were no safety nets, no hospitals, no backup plans. Starvation became so severe one winter that some settlers resorted to cannibalism. But against the odds, Jamestown survived, and that survival lit a fire back in England. More settlers came, more land was cleared, and the colony began to grow. Tobacco saved them. It became the cash crop that fueled the economy. But it also fueled something darker, the demand for labor. Indentured servants, poor Europeans who traded years of work for passage across the Atlantic, became the backbone of the colony at first. They worked long hours in the fields, often dying before their contracts ended. When that wasn't enough, colonists turned to enslaved Africans. The first recorded arrival of enslaved people in English America happened in 1619, and from that moment on, the story of colonial America was tied to the story of slavery. But colonial life wasn't just hardship and labor. It was a constant negotiation between freedom and control. Some settlers came seeking religious liberty like the Puritans in Massachusetts, but once they had it, they often denied it to others. Dissenters were banished, sometimes executed. The colonies became experiments in self-government, but they were also places of rigid hierarchy. If you were a white landowner, you had power. If you weren't, you fought for scraps of it. There was tension everywhere between settlers and Native Americans, between rich planters and poor farmers, between colonists and the distant crown that ruled them. Rebellions flared. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 saw angry farmers burn Jamestown to the ground because they felt the governor wasn't protecting them from frontier attacks. It was one of the first signs that colonists were willing to take up arms not just against outsiders, but against their own leaders. Colonial towns were small but growing. Streets were muddy, houses made of wood and thatched churches at the center of community life. Education mattered, at least in New England, where learning to read the Bible was seen as a moral duty. Harvard College was founded as early as 1636 to train ministers. Meanwhile, in the southern colonies, sprawling plantations shaped a very different way of life. With wealth concentrated in the hands of a few families, trade connected the colonies to the wider world. Ships carried tobacco, furs, and timber to Europe and returned with manufactured goods. But those same ships were part of the triangular trade carrying enslaved people across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage. The wealth of the colonies was built on that suffering, though few wanted to admit it. Despite the danger, the population kept growing. Immigrants came from all over Europe: Germans, Dutch, Scots, Irish, bringing their own customs, languages, and religions. By the early 1700s, the colonies were no longer just outposts. They were bustling societies with their own culture, their own politics, and their own ambitions. As the 1700s unfolded, the colonies were no longer fragile footholds. They were thriving, restless, and starting to look less like England and more like something entirely new. Markets buzzed with trade, towns grew busier, and a distinct American identity slowly took shape, though no one would have called it that yet. Everyday life was a mixture of progress and hardship. In the northern colonies, small farms produced just enough for families to live on, while merchants grew rich from shipping and fishing. In the south, plantations dominated the landscape, worked by enslaved Africans whose numbers were growing every year. Slavery was no longer just a labor system, it was becoming a foundation of the economy. Religion played a powerful role, but it was beginning to shift. In the 1730s and 1740s, the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. Preachers with fiery voices drew huge crowds in open fields, warning that salvation was urgent, personal, and not something controlled by church authorities. It was emotional, intense, and controversial, and it planted a seed of rebellious thinking. If you could question your minister, why not question other authorities too? Life on the frontier was a different story entirely. Settlers pushed farther west, carving farms out of forests, constantly on edge from the threat of conflict with Native American nations who were defending their land. Violence flared in cycles, raids, reprisals, and easy truces as two worlds collided again and again. The British Crown tried to control the pace of expansion, but settlers were hard to stop. The desire for land was stronger than royal decrees. The colonies weren't peaceful internally either. Class tensions simmered as rich planters and merchants gained power while poor farmers and laborers struggled. Riots broke out over food shortages, taxes, and unfair trade practices. Smuggling became common, not just a crime but almost a point of pride, a way of saying that colonial life would not be dictated by distant governors. And then came war. The French and Indian War, part of a global struggle between Britain and France, turned the colonies into battlefields. Colonists fought alongside British soldiers, learned military tactics, and paid high taxes to support the war effort. When the war ended in 1763, Britain gained huge amounts of territory, but it also gained massive debt. To pay it off, Parliament started taxing the colonies directly. That's when the first sparks of real resistance were lit. Colonists weren't against taxes in theory, they were used to paying local taxes, but they hated the idea of being taxed by a government across the ocean where they had no voice. No taxation without representation became a rallying cry, not just a slogan. Boycotts, protests, and pamphlets spread through the towns. People dumped British tea into Boston Harbor rather than pay the duty on it. Ordinary citizens became radicals overnight, forming secret groups like the Sons of Liberty. They didn't just talk about politics, they acted, sometimes violently, intimidating tax collectors, burning effigies, and calling public meetings that stirred thousands. But not everyone supported rebellion. Many colonists remained loyal to the crown, believing that breaking away would bring chaos and ruin. Families and communities divided. Taverns became places where politics turned into shouting matches. The colonies were becoming a powder keg, and it was only a matter of time before someone struck a match. The Puritans' ideals began shaping everything around them. Towns were organized with meeting houses at their center, where decisions about crops, roads, even punishments were made in public gatherings. It was a mix of democracy and strict religious control, where speaking out against church leadership could still get you fined or whipped. Families worked the land together, and children were taught to read primarily so they could study the Bible, which shows how faith and daily life were inseparable. Meanwhile, across the colonies, other groups were experimenting with different models. In Maryland, Catholics tried to create a safe haven from persecution, and in Pennsylvania, William Penn's vision of a Quaker-led society focused on equality and peace drew settlers from across Europe. The result was a patchwork of beliefs and cultures, each colony testing its own idea of freedom. The economy started to take shape as well. In the South, plantations thrived on tobacco, rice, and later cotton, creating vast wealth for a few and hard labor for many. Indentured servants, who traded years of work for passage across the ocean, were common at first, but by the late 1600s, the demand for permanent labor led to the widespread use of enslaved Africans. This dark reality was one of the biggest contradictions in colonial America, a society that spoke of liberty while relying on forced labor. In the North, trade and shipbuilding boomed. Cities like Boston and New York became centers of commerce, their harbors full of goods arriving from Europe and the Caribbean. The triangular trade connected these colonies to a global network, moving sugar, rum, and human lives in a brutal cycle that fueled growth. Tensions with native peoples never fully disappeared. Every wave of settlement pushed tribes further from their lands, and despite occasional treaties, violence often flared. The Pequot War and later King Felix War were devastating conflicts that left entire villages burned and populations decimated on both sides. These events hardened attitudes, leading colonists to see native tribes less as neighbors and more as obstacles. But there were moments of cooperation to trade partnerships, shared knowledge of crops and survival skills, and even alliances during European wars fought on American soil. As generations passed, colonists started to think of themselves less as Europeans and more as something new. A unique American identity was forming, shaped by frontier life, religious diversity, and the challenges of survival in a vast and tamed land. Yet, even as they grew more independent, the British Crown still ruled over them, enforcing trade laws and appointing governors. Many colonists accepted this as the price of protection, especially during conflicts like the French and Indian War, where British troops defended their settlements. But the seeds of unrest were quietly being planted by taxes, restrictions, and the feeling of being treated as second-class citizens would one day bring all these colonies together in ways no one could yet imagine. When the war with France ended, Britain expected the colonies to help pay the massive debt it had accumulated. This marked the beginning of policies that would transform loyal subjects into revolutionaries. New taxes like the Sugar Act and the infamous Stamp Act were introduced, sparking outrage among colonists who believed they should not be taxed without representation in Parliament. Pamphlets, speeches, and town meetings became platforms for resistance. Ordinary citizens began seeing themselves not just as farmers, merchants, or craftsmen, but as participants in a broader fight for rights. Boycotts of British goods spread across the colonies. And suddenly the act of drinking tea or wearing homespun clothes was a political statement. As British soldiers were stationed in major cities to enforce order, tension grew. The Boston Massacre turned public opinion even further against the Crown, as colonists used the deaths of several unarmed men to rally support for their cause. Underground networks like the Committees of Correspondence kept the colonies informed and united, and when Parliament doubled down with measures like the Tea Act, rebellion felt inevitable. The Boston Tea Party, dramatic and defiant, was more than a protest over tea. It was a message that colonial patience had reached its breaking point. In response, Britain tightened its grip with the so-called Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor and limiting self-government in Massachusetts. Instead of isolating the troublemakers, this only convinced other colonies that they could be next. Delegates from across the continent met at the First Continental Congress, a bold step toward unity. They demanded their rights as Englishmen but also began to envision a future where they might stand on their own. When shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, there was no turning back. Farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen took up arms against the most powerful empire in the world, not knowing whether they would win or even survive. The Revolutionary War was brutal, with devastating winters, starvation, and constant shortages. But it also brought extraordinary moments: George Washington's daring crossing of the Delaware, the unlikely victory at Saratoga that convinced France to join the fight, and the perseverance of militias who refused to quit even after crushing defeats. Women, enslaved people, and native allies all played roles that are often overlooked, keeping farms running, acting as spies, and fighting for promises of freedom that were not always fulfilled. By the time Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the world had witnessed something remarkable. 13 scattered colonies had become a nation, but independence was just the beginning. The challenge of building a government that balanced liberty and order would prove as difficult as winning the war itself. Debates raged over how strong the central government should be, what rights should be guaranteed, and how to reconcile ideals of freedom with the reality of slavery and displacement of native tribes. The Constitution was a bold experiment, a compromise that reflected both the hopes and the fears of its creators. It was imperfect, but it set in motion a system that could evolve. And over time it would be tested again and again. This journey through colonial history shows how conflict, diversity, and determination shaped a society that eventually dared to break free and define itself. It is a story of contradictions, liberty and oppression, faith and intolerance, cooperation and violence, but that tension is what gave it strength. It reminds us that the America we know was not inevitable. It was built through choices, struggles, and sacrifices that still echo in the country's identity today.